Hello and welcome to the 2022 Liddon Lecture presented by the Society of the Faith. I am delighted to welcome the Revd Dr Charlie Bell. He has come a bit of a way from the choir of Chichester Cathedral and is now a Fellow of Girton College, Cambridge, a Clinical Fellow with King's College London and South London at Maudsley NHS Foundation, and also a curate in the Diocese of Southwark, as if he had nothing better to do with his time, and author of the recently released book Queer Holiness, available since a reprint in all good bookshops. And he's going to talk to us on the subject of, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, what we've learnt and where we go. Dr. Bell.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to speak today in this very esteemed body. I hope that, I heard just before we started that this felt almost like a seminar. I hope in many ways that is the kind of feeling that you might have as we go through this, because as has just been said, I'm a curate, so I'm new to all of this in a sense. But I have a little bit of a kind of, I've had a secular job for a while, and I've worked in healthcare and worked in the House of Commons just a few years ago in the middle of the COVID pandemic, or as it started and progressed. So I may offer you some thoughts, but it may be that you have your own thoughts. And hopefully we'll have time at the end to perhaps dig into some of those things and the things that perhaps didn't chime with you from what I say, and perhaps those things that did. So I think it's fair to say that the COVID pandemic has left us in whatever walk of life or whatever sphere of life with a huge number of as yet unanswered questions. That's most certainly true, I think, of the Church, both in terms of the philosophical or theological issues that the COVID pandemic raised, but also practical issues. Yet I would also argue right from the start that the line between practical and theological has at times been rather hard to determine, and sometimes that suited those who have been making the decisions themselves. More on that later. But this afternoon, what I'd like to try to do is to tease out some of those practical and theological questions that this unprecedented pandemic has raised for us in the Church, and also see whether the changed landscape which we now find ourselves in, a landscape which is shaped by both what happened in the height of the pandemic, but also as COVID-19 has moved to a less acute phase as we are in now, whether that landscape can hold up a mirror to who and what we are as Catholic Christians in the Church of England in the 21st century. Before getting into the meat of the issue, I wanted to raise something which hasn't really been heard that much in wider societal discussions of the pandemic, but which I have heard, albeit often a little tongue-in-cheek, amongst people debating the way that the Church has responded. And that is whether this pandemic is really all that unprecedented anyway. I imagine for some that would raise a bit of an eyebrow, but there is, I think, a certain misplaced glamour to make reference to the pandemics of the past and to bemoan how much better the Church did during them. From a Catholic imagination, the idea of priests celebrating the Mass on street corners or risking life and limb to visit ailing plague victims is fairly easy to contrast to edicts to close the Church and to set an example. Yet from the offset, I think it's really important for us to realise quite how different this pandemic was from anything that we've seen before. Different for a number of reasons. The first, I think, is quite obvious. We're in a more globalised and well-travelled world than ever before. Back in January 2020, when COVID was beginning to show up on the radar of health policymakers across the world, I think it became abundantly clear that were this virus to be found in Beijing, remembering that at that stage the international community was under the impression, and what is almost certainly a false impression, that COVID was only a small pneumonia-like virus in Wuhan province, that this virus, if it was present in Beijing, would also be present in Berlin, in New York, in London, and very rapidly the rest of the world. The age of globalization is ultimately the age of a globalized virus. What was different too was our ultimate scientific knowledge. Whilst lateral flow tests, PCR and the rest of it all sound very much every day to the UK population in 2022, this was not the case in 2020. And yet the sheer ingenuity, fast thinking and action, and the significant technological nous that international scientists and bioengineers have shown since the start of the pandemic remains quite extraordinary. So, compared to previous pandemics, we ultimately had a possible exit route. An exit route that required us to understand the pathogen, find ways to tackle it, develop the methods and mechanisms to do so, with all the waste and the cost that that entails, and then employing those vaccines and treatments in a way that could genuinely allow us to end a pandemic ahead of time. And I think that in itself is no mean feat. Yet the third reason that this pandemic was different to those that we've seen before was the sheer level of unknown that ran through our understanding of the virus and the illness it caused. This had an impact at a political level. We had prepared for a flu pandemic, and a very different kind of illness actually hit, but also at the level of the national psyche and in our public health communities. The most obvious place that this lack of clarity was seen was in the do we, don't we mask policy in the initial stages, and the somewhat confusing regulations over singing that ultimately related to whether COVID was aerosol or droplet generated. The fact is, we just didn't know, and the messaging from central government was not at all clear at times, something which significantly impacted, I think, on churches' decision-making and ability to make decisions. But something just as damaging and risky as the virus became a major player on the national stage too: fear. And that fear remains to this day. It continues to haunt communities and individuals, and it's something which was deliberately used as a political tool, albeit for what were good ends, in preventing the spread of COVID. But the fear that came naturally and the fear that was employed as a tool have not gone away. And for me, that's one of the key consequences of COVID with which we as a society and as a church have not yet fully grappled. I worry that if we don't address that fear, try to tease out the whys and the hows, and attempt to recalibrate, then we're storing up trouble for ourselves and, in the church, possibly failing in what we are called to be. But more of that anon. Now, what I don't intend to do in what I say today is to preach from hindsight or needlessly criticise individuals who are working under extreme levels of pressure and stress in unprecedented scenarios. Much has been said and written in that vein, some of it justified to my mind, and some of it sometimes a little unfair. But what I do want to raise at this stage is my unease at the seeming general lack of reflection or willingness to hear criticism. Criticism in the best possible sense, a collegial form of criticism that ultimately leads to improvement from those who led the Church of England's response to COVID. I'm also deeply uneasy when I hear narratives revised, renewed and reformed, if you will, which fail to accurately represent what actually happened and why it happened during COVID. And I'm particularly uneasy when all conversation about this is shut down in the name of not carping on about what happened in the heat of battle. No serious organisation would refuse to attempt some lessons learnt analysis, genuine lessons learnt analysis, and the church should by no means exempt itself from that. What I'd like to do then is firstly address the practical issues that the pandemic created or raised, and then consider the philosophical or the theological. And one of the very key practical issues we must address, the elephant in the room as it were, is the closure of churches. This is a complicated topic, and whilst the government did indeed require the closure of churches, it did not require that clergy were banned from them, which was a decision made by the Archbishop with the agreement, possibly tacitly, but the agreement of his diocesans, at least in its implementation, if not in the decision-making process itself. And whilst it's true that the government did ask that churches were closed, there was no pushback from the House of Bishops as a corporate body. In fact, as I've said, they went much further than simply require them to be shut, and this does suggest that they thought it a price worth paying in the circumstance. Whether that was a right or a wrong decision in the particular circumstances we found ourselves is in many ways academic at this stage, but it is simply a matter of fact that it happened. And for me, one of the very key practical things that the pandemic highlighted is how unprepared we were as a church for anything like this happening. We did not have the capacity or means to make the best decisions quickly. Instead, we had decision-making by bishops' WhatsApp, and decisions which were then communicated without any serious evidence to back them up. Of course, it's challenging. A pandemic comes out of the blue, but a pandemic in many ways was inevitable, and it's somewhat surprising that we had done so little to prepare. Now, this was a major problem during the pandemic, but also highlights something very serious about how we as a church are making decisions more generally. It's no secret that many bishops get very frustrated by how clergy complain about the decisions that they make, particularly decisions made in meetings of the House of Bishops. But they cannot really be surprised, or at least shouldn't be, given the appalling lack of transparency that surrounds these decisions. During the pandemic, we were told that there was specific medical evidence being given to bishops that supported their prevention of clergy entering their own churches. That turned out simply to be untrue. Again, I want to stress that none of this is opinion. It's a matter of unambiguous and recorded fact. And a very clear take-home must be that decision-making in the church needs to be immediately more transparent, and that a mechanism for collegial challenge needs to be found. The current situation is ultimately an unsustainable one. A related point is the sheer lack of knowledge and experience in the decision-making bodies of the church as related to the pandemic. In fact, I might revise that slightly. It's not that there was a lack of knowledge and experience, but there was a lack of willingness to engage such knowledge and experience as existed. Now, I should declare an interest here. I was, as I said, at the time working for the House of Commons Health and Social Care Committee, and as such, had a pretty good idea of how things were looking and how they were going. I was also an ordinand, so my immediate thought was, how can I help? The answer, in short, was not at all, thank you very much. Now, I'm a doctor and a priest, so I'm aware that my ego is probably both oversized and rather fragile. But to look on this for a moment, in some attempt at objectivity, there does seem to be a deeply problematical position for the church to take. There were, of course, many more qualified people than me to opine on how things might progress or on what we might do, but they weren't being engaged either, certainly at the start. Instead, the Church of England, whatever that means, closed ranks and did something which I'm afraid to say, as a current minister in secular employment, appears to be part of its modus operandum. My second practical take-home is then this. The church needs to learn that Father doesn't always know best and find a way to unleash the huge, and I mean really huge, levels of talent, knowledge, and experience that is found amongst its members, whether they are lay or ordained. As a good Catholic, I understand the authority placed in the priesthood and the importance of decision-making on church matters ultimately sitting with the bishops. But we need to find a way to be better at knowing what we don't know and asking people who might know more. This is true at a parish level, in theological training, at the national level. We have to find a way to do this better. And I think our current approach is ultimately damaging us. There are two interlinked practical things that I think we need to think about when we look back at the pandemic. The first of these is something that has become almost an existential question for us. Will people come back? The closure of church buildings for right or wrong matters, and a key consequence has been the impact on church-going in the form we would previously have recognised. Physical bodies in a physical space meeting together. This, corporate worship, is surely at the very heart of our faith. And it's understandable that during the pandemic, decisions were made that had a significant impact on how we could express this. But the growth of the virtual and our engagement with it does, I think, pose a threat to how we have traditionally envisaged Catholic worship. That's not to say that all virtual is bad, far from it. For some, the growth of the virtual medium has almost certainly opened up a way back into the church that had previously been shut to them. The ability to attend church from home is not only more convenient, it might also be the only way that housebound or frail parishioners can attend services. In a sense, the inability of us all to meet together has meant that our attention has turned to improving the provision for such folk almost by mistake, which may indeed be live streaming or recording of worship, but which might also include the provision of more written materials for those at home to aid in their private devotions. This renewed focus must not be lost in how we move forward, yet to stop at the virtual seems to me to be only half the story. Virtual attending of worship may be helpful, but in all the talk of live streaming, we mustn't forget the importance of incarnational ministry more generally. And this, in practical terms, will include the visiting of the sick and a renewed focus on bringing the physical aspects of worship to them as much as we can. In many parishes, of course, this is happening, but we must also not lose sight of it in the narrative that we tell about ourselves as Christians. I'll return to some of the more theological questions that surround virtual worship in a moment. For now, I want to discuss the other practical issue that has reared its head during the pandemic, a return to that idea of fear. Now, fear as a concept sits somewhere between the practical and the abstract, and our engagement with it must surely also have theological overtones. In fact, it's a rather superficial distinction that I've made between the two outcomes of the pandemic, the practical and the theological. And perhaps I might just say a few words about that before returning to a substantive discussion of fear. I think one thing that's become increasingly clear on a review of our decision-making processes during COVID is the general triumph of pragmatism over theological thinking. The pragmatism has meant that the discussion of things such as virtual communion, the common cup, singing, corporate worship and reopening, private masses and so on, has often operated on a level which has not, to my mind, taken the theological implications of our decisions seriously enough. It's certainly true that the Church of England has a large number of different theologies interwoven into the whole. Not an endless number, though, despite what some might suggest. And yet it has felt at times that the church corporate has been acting in a way that focuses much more on what must be done rather than on the why. And at times it appears that this is, at least in part, because of concerns about theological disagreements, because of a general lack of interest in theological issues at the heart of decision-making processes and in the church more widely, and because of a kind of blind panic which found its way into our response to COVID. Now, that blind panic sits firmly within the fear that I'd like to address, but I don't think it entirely explains why we've been so lax in our theological thinking. I'll address some specific questions towards the end of this lecture, but I do think it's fairly concerning that the Church has not made any serious or significant attempt to do this thinking herself. If we simply change our practice, and we don't think through the implications of what that says about us as an institution and what it says about us as worshipping communities, then we run the risk of losing who we are in the determination to find ways to keep going, whatever the cost. But to return to fear. There have been plenty of entirely good reasons for why fear has spread during the pandemic, and thus why it has impacted on the way churches have responded to it. At the start, as I mentioned earlier, very little was known about the virus and the impact that it might have. And there do remain groups in society who remain very vulnerable to it. Added to that, the pandemic has created places of serious trauma for communities and individuals. People have lost livelihoods, but have also lost lives. Many people have suddenly been at much greater risk to their health than ever before, and healthcare workers and other essential workers have been at increased risk of morbidity and mortality in their day-to-day lives. None of this can be disputed, and nor can the fact that the composition of our churches, which often number amongst their congregations the elderly and the vulnerable, mean that these things need to be taken seriously on a practical level. Yet theologically too, this is important. We are to be places of inclusion and places where the vulnerable and the sick are privileged. And yet, we are also to be places which must surely challenge any overarching narrative of fear. And herein lies the tension, which I don't feel we fully addressed. In part, this is because there are no easy answers, however loud the voices have been that suggest there are. In part too, it's because our church communities and leadership really struggle with the concept of risk and risk assessment, which is an understandable position for us to find ourselves in. And in part, it's because the return to normality path has ultimately become a political just as much as a practical one. It's been fairly disheartening to see some Christians describing those who wanted to stop wearing masks as uncaring and unthinking. And similarly, seeing Christians sneering at those who feel deeply uncomfortable about returning to full physical worship. Debates around the meaning of in-person, virtual, face-to-face and similar have raged not only in the world of the church, but in the world outside, and in many ways have heightened the continued exclusion felt by large numbers of disabled people, many of whom have felt entirely ignored as the world returned to some kind of post-pandemic normality, which didn't necessarily include them. The worst possible outcome of all this, of course, would be a further entrenchment of an us and them narrative. It's certainly true that for some people, fear has driven an entirely disproportionate risk aversion and caution that has led to an inappropriate level of refusal to move forwards out of the pandemic. We might think, for example, of some parishes who continue to offer an only online offering, although we must always be careful, of course, to judge parishes without knowing the full story of why they're doing it or what they're doing. And it's also true that some challenge of overcautious narratives is important, both on a personal and a corporate level. One might think of the inhumane decision to prevent the dying from seeing their loved ones, or the rather bizarre advice issued not to get too close to the dying during pastoral visits in case one made them ill. Fear certainly infused through into church policy, and the relative lack of challenge to government regulations, and the timidity and the lack of challenge has not gone unnoticed. Yet it's also important to recognise that the manner and the form of any challenge, most particularly when challenging individuals, needs to ultimately take seriously the importance of the experience of those who do remain fearful for a number of reasons. This is ultimately a really complex conversation and will involve cultural, contextual, local and national factors, but it is one which the church should be uniquely well placed to have. COVID has perhaps been a wake-up call to us all as churches that our most vulnerable members have not always been placed at the centre in our thinking. And we must find a way to re-engage with that question in a way that doesn't throw out our incarnational self-understanding. Issues of disability and illness certainly feature in our response to COVID. But I think we must too mention something that has not necessarily been well addressed by the Church of England corporately during the pandemic, much to our shame, and that's of class and poverty. When we were told to stay at home to set an example, I'm afraid this quite simply didn't reflect the general experience of thousands of faithful Christians who were unable to stay at home due to the nature of their jobs, often poorly paid, and often jobs which were precarious and therefore also posed an increased risk to health. Setting an example was, in hindsight, a really rather middle class and, dare I say, patronising way of responding to a global health challenge that impacted different groups in society in very different ways. We did not appear to recognise this, and this was both in our messaging and our visuals. Masses said in beautiful home settings did very little to speak to the experience of those in multi-person inadequate housing, and also in our engagement with government policy. Far too often, I think, we parroted government diktats without getting properly to grips with how these measures, or lack of them, were impacting on the most vulnerable in society. I might suggest that this would have been a better focus for the advisors in Church House, rather than the development of guidance which, at times, contradicted and confused that coming from central government. It's a tricky balance, of course, and also not a zero-sum game. But the lack of a prophetic voice on this from the Church, I feel, was noticeable. Ultimately, a consideration of where our focus was during the pandemic begins to get us, or at least should do, into more theological questions of who and what we want the Church to be, who indeed we want clergy to be, and what we think they should be doing. When the pandemic started, there was a somewhat existential crisis faced by clergy. What are clergy supposed to be about? What are clergy supposed to be doing? The edict to stay at home seemed entirely contrary to everything that we say about the Christian ministry. And this was further compounded, at least by a fair number of Catholics, by the forbidding of Mass within churches, and yet the requirement for clergy to enter their buildings on occasion for insurance purposes only. Whilst it's certainly true that clergy weren't alone in this existential crisis, its ramifications continue, not least because of what it appeared that the central church and bishops were saying to clergy about their role and the essentials that defined that role. Now, it's unquestionable that huge numbers of clergy and their partners rose to the occasion with extraordinary rapidity and willingness to embrace change. Whether that was technological know-how or finding ways to reach out to parishioners or staff food banks or a whole host of other things, churches reached out, both lay and ordained, and offered practical, on-the-ground support in ways that would previously have often been thought far too difficult. What I'm saying then isn't to be derogatory to the extraordinary effort that went into the pandemic response, but it did become clear during the pandemic that the vision of the priesthood and the church community that many in the parishes held appeared to radically differ from that espoused from church authorities and, frankly, many bishops. The pandemic, in a sense, revealed rather than created these difficulties, but we cannot simply ignore them now the drive towards a new normal is in full steam. One particularly disappointing aspect of the pandemic was the lack of imagination shown corporately in the role of the deacon. There were many tasks crying out to be handled through and by people set aside for such a role, deacons. Yet because we appear to have such an impoverished theology of the diaconate, this simply didn't happen at a wide scale or corporate level. One positive step in the wake of the pandemic would be a serious focus on the role of the deacon, most particularly the permanent diaconate, not only at the parish level, where it's far more well-defined in parishes that recognise this distinctive ministry, but also amongst theological educators and bishops too. In many ways, deacons should have been a ready-made pandemic response team, and we need to think about how we better make use of their distinctive ministry in the future, rather than seeing it as a simple stepping stone on the way to priestly ordination. At the heart of the priestly calling, in contrast, is the Eucharist. And my goodness, did the pandemic offer some challenges to that. And if I'm honest, I think this is where the real scandal of poor theological workings out lie, not to put too fine a point on it. Because whilst lots of things were done for practical reasons, things that surely made the reformers at least turn in their graves, too often this has been defended in the name of practicality. And similarly, the implications of what we did during COVID, what we did because of necessity perhaps, but to which we nevertheless lent an air of validity and acceptance, have not been properly engaged with. At the two ends of the scale are the concepts of private masses and Zoom Eucharists. I think it's fair to say that neither of these had been much on the mind of at least the majority of church folk before the pandemic arose, and yet have become pretty common currency since. To take private masses first, there will doubtless be a whole host of different opinions on this, even within this room. But I think it's fair to say that the general position of the church has been to say a pretty firm no to these kind of things taking place in the past. And yet, the moment the pandemic hit, the concept of a private mass became not anathema, but commonplace. I happen to think that the word private is a bit of a misnomer and shows a poverty of thinking around the doctrine of the communion of saints, but I appreciate that I may be a minority in the Church of England on that point. And yet, these masses were allowed to happen. The priest often alone, possibly at the kitchen table, potentially but not always live streaming the mass to congregation far and wide. I'll return to those issues of participation in a moment, but it is worth just taking a moment to reflect on the fact that ultimately, a mass is a mass is a mass. We may say that private masses were only permitted because of exceptional circumstances, but we might also ask what other exceptional circumstances might permit such masses to take place. And we might also, reasonably, I think, say that given those were bona fide masses, has that ultimately changed our underlying doctrine on the nature of the celebration of the Eucharist? I don't think that's actually overstating the position. Yes, there was a necessity, but there was also a mass. To my mind, those questions need more work and should have had more work done on them before a pandemic, so that our response would have been driven by underlying principle and theology rather than what is loosely described as pastoral need. A pastoral need can cover many sins, but it shouldn't. And as we'll see when considering Zoom masses, there's more than a hint of the slippery slope. To turn to those Zoom masses then. Now, time is short, and there have been so many different ways that Zoom or Facebook or whatever it is people have used to connect people with Mass have been used. However, we can, I think, split them into three recognisably different forms. The first is the make your own communion version, which I'm not going to make much of here because this has been addressed in plenty of places elsewhere. The only comment I might make is that it was fascinating to see how many members of the Church of England had a fundamentally different Eucharistic theology to that established by the Church of England. Secondly, we have the recorded Eucharistic form. This form often appeared to make use of what I might rather disparagingly call the patchwork Mass, by which I mean making use of different videos stitched together to produce a coherent whole. Now, the reasoning for this is entirely understandable, to produce a Mass that involves more people than simply the clergy. The problem, of course, is that questions do need to be asked about whether this remains, in effect, a Eucharist at all. That is, whether for the Eucharist to be a Eucharist, one requires a consistent temporal thread that flows throughout the liturgy. Again, more work needs to be done on this. Here we see the pastoral reasons raising its head again, but we need to really think about whether we are doing damage to the form of the Eucharist by cutting and pasting in this way, or perhaps we're not. Anecdotes abound of clergy redoing the Eucharistic prayer for the camera, and indeed of clergy recording the entire Holy Week set of liturgies, one after the other, in order to ensure everything is ready for their congregation. Entirely understandable, of course, but theologically, liturgically, what is going on? What do we actually think is necessary and central to the Eucharist? And to put it more positively, what might these pastoral accommodations tell us about our Eucharistic doctrine and about what we think is most important? Is participation, however imperfect, more important than a temporal sequence during the Eucharist? These questions, of course, don't arise in a vacuum, and there's an entire history of Christian thought that, whilst not directly addressing the challenges of our time, is able to speak to our theological thinking. The problem for us in the Church of England is that we seem so unwilling, or more worryingly, unable to engage with it. The final kind of Zoom Eucharist is the live streamed one. And this raises questions of what participation or being present really means. It was fascinating to see how many parishes chose to live stream the Mass rather than the daily office, whatever the tradition. And I wonder what that tells us. But it's also, I think, true that there's something fundamentally different about participating in the daily office online and somehow participating in the Mass. Once again, there is work to be done there which might help us refine and interrogate our Eucharistic doctrine. I would strongly urge a commitment to doing this work, because without it, not only will we have learnt very little theologically, but we may end up inadvertently doing damage to the inherited traditions that we are stewards of in this generation. In a sense, through all of these theological and Eucharistic questions, we need to be asking ourselves, what exactly is going on? Does it matter? What does this tell us about who we claim to be? Is a Eucharistic fast, so-called, really compatible with our theology? Is pastoral accommodation always the right thing? And, to throw in a grenade, in the context of communities that are unable to celebrate the Eucharist for long periods of time, does lay presidency begin to rear its head, at least in the context of so-called pastoral accommodation? If not, why not? And what does this then tell us about the nature of priesthood? My fear is that despite all the noise over individual communion cups, these much more fundamental questions, fundamental to our lives together as incarnational corporate Christians, and questions which feed into the more practical concerns that I raised earlier, have not even been acknowledged, let alone addressed, by far too many people. My final point, I want to address something which is probably quite uncomfortable to those of us who are of a Catholic bent, and that is the loss, maybe not complete, but certainly significant, of the signs, symbols, and rituals of Catholic Christianity in the popular mind. Churches that offered church on the go, essentially services of worship, music, and discussion, have dominated the Church of England in COVID genre. We may bemoan this, I certainly do, but we also need to be alert to the fact that much of what we might hold dear is no longer recognised by those outside the church, and quite frankly, those within too. It's perhaps this which lies beneath the pragmatism that has shaped so much of the church's response to the pandemic. The Mass just isn't seen as that important. Yes, it's important, but it's not life or death. Similarly, our other embodied practices, embodiment and corporate worship, being two of the hallmarks of the Catholic tradition. So one thing that COVID must surely cause us to do is to put our minds much more seriously to a reinvigoration within and without the church of our sacramental life, our life of ritual worship that is unashamedly Catholic in nature. Yes, there is a glamour of thinking of the priest in Lampedusa's The Leopard, who brings Christ to the people in the form of the host and engenders devotion and veneration. But we must be honest to ourselves that this is not the current state of Church of England Christianity. Perhaps it never has been. But even in places which were decidedly Catholic in the past, we've seen a definitive decline in the obviousness of this liturgy and ritual to the average person in the street. This is a serious matter indeed, and requires some inward thinking and some outward looking. It requires us too to rediscover the language of Catholicism without feeling embarrassed about it or feel an endless need to pander to other traditions' way of doing, saying, or being. We need to regain the initiative in not only describing what we do, but also why we do it. And we need to do that in a way that doesn't lead us down the endless rabbit hole of conversations about women clergy and gay marriage, however important we think those things are or aren't. Of course, discussion about the Mass in that context is challenging, but if we truly believe that what we offer is needed, then we should be willing to do that work. And I might venture that the recent positive public response to the liturgy at the Queen's funeral suggests that even if it's not fully understood, there is an open door to the role of liturgy in public life. To end then, perhaps a note of hope. It's certainly true that the Church of England's response to the pandemic left at least a fair amount to be desired, and the Catholic voice did feel and continues to feel sidelined. Yet it's really not up to anyone other than ourselves to take the initiative and to change the narrative. And whilst the picture from an institutional perspective may not be that rosy, nonetheless, there was example after example after example of positive things happening in the parishes, ultimately in the engine room of the church. At its best, the Catholic movement has much to say about both the very best and the very worst things of the world, about the beauty of the created order, the transcendence and the wonder of worship, but also about the scourge of poverty and the scandal of division we still see in the world. We have a tradition that places sign and word alongside one another, that recognises the importance of witness as well as evangelism, of ministry as an equal partner to mission. And we understand mission in deep and all-encompassing ways, which, if offered to and accepted by the world and the church, could be part of a more wonderful participation in the life and work of God. COVID has left us with many more questions than answers, and yet questions should never be feared, but rather relished, because they give us an opportunity to dig even deeper within ourselves, to refine and interrogate our faith. COVID has held up a mirror to us all, and at times it has found us all a little wanting. But to my mind, COVID has too reminded us of the importance not only of the Christian life, but of the Catholic expression of it. And I'm convinced that if we hold on to our convictions, learn inwards and lean outwards, that Catholic inheritance still has much to offer to the world. Thank you.
Will you take questions?
Only if then, yes, no, that's fine.
Thank you, Dr. Bell, for a most stimulating lecture. I particularly warmed to your point towards the end about the value of liturgy in terms of mission. I have long believed that there is a converting power in liturgy, which was very well exemplified by the Queen's funeral and the surrounding ceremonies. I wonder if you could say any more about how we might expand the experience of the nation after that event.
I think one thing we need to be ready to do is to explain why we're doing what we're doing. So I think lots of people switched on BBC One or whatever it was they were using to watch the funeral and suddenly were sort of wowed by this extraordinary, beautiful, somehow transcendent experience, which probably they didn't expect. And I think people found the pageantry exciting and the rest of it, but I think actually the simple but nonetheless dignified liturgy was important to them. What we can't do now is to then lose all of that and to have to wait for the next royal event for people to tune into. That said, I think sometimes that's the only time that people will touch it. And if that's the only time that people touch it, that's fine. That's a way in. I think we need to be better at explaining why we're doing it. And I think part of that is getting back into the church and getting the church to explain why we're doing what we're doing. So much in my mind of the output from the church, corporate, is pretty facile and pretty unimpressive in terms of its descriptions. And it treats people sometimes in a way which you wouldn't really treat a primary school class. And for me, that's really a problem. Because it's not that people necessarily have the language to describe what they're feeling or seeing or understanding through the liturgy. But that doesn't mean that they don't somehow have some innate essence of what's going on. And I think we need to move beyond simple descriptions and simple answers towards opening up the deep, deep questions that liturgy itself opens up. And I think if we could focus on engaging with the church to try and encourage the church corporate to do some more of that kind of communication with the wider public, maybe that could be a good start.
Do you think it's equally important alongside the Eucharist that the church should be thinking about funerals in a future pandemic I don't know whether it's just coincidental, but during that period, the number of advertisements for simple so-called cremations, whereby the body is simply removed, burnt, nobody attends, but they all have a lovely party afterwards remembering the departed, which from a Christian point of view is a wholly inadequate approach to responding to someone's death. So that's one question. How would you see us needing to think more about funerals and how, being retired, I don't know what the guidance was as to whether there was any guidance during. And the other absence of comment, at least public within the church, was the fact of death. And how people might prepare for it. The church seemed remarkably, even in the middle of a pandemic, to talk about death and its significance and how we prepare for it.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I just echo your second point. I think that's a very valid point and one which I don't think we've grappled with. I'm just, without wanting to sell my next book, I'm just finishing a manuscript on death and the communion of saints. I mean, I think the church itself needs to do some more work on, that seems to be a bit of a broken record for me today, but I think the church itself needs to do some more work on death because we shy away from it. And I think the pandemic was almost a perfect exemplar of how society is under the belief that nobody dies. And that when someone dies, it's fascinating, I hear a lot, when someone dies, it's a tragedy. Well, it's sad. Was the Queen's death a tragedy? I'm not sure in any serious description of the word tragedy that tragedy would be the right word to describe it. But yet all deaths are described as a tragedy. The Queen's death in newspapers, a national tragedy. So I think we need to get better at recognising that death it's going to happen. So if the church knows it's going to have to talk about it because it's one of the definites that's going to happen in people's lives. So it'd be good for us to think about that more and to probably have got in touch with probably what is there in a public mood, which is picking back on your first question. So I feel like the Queen's funeral, in a sense, was the funeral for all the people who died during COVID. In a sense, at least for a large number of people, that was an opportunity to publicly mourn. It was okay to be sad, however sort of absurd it felt to be sad. I remember I was sitting in a train when I got the news, and I was sort of unbelievably sad. And I thought, what is wrong with you? Pull yourself together. And I was wearing a clerical collar, and I thought, gosh, I didn't want to see a priest crying in the train, for goodness sake. Well, maybe they did, actually. And maybe that's something that the funeral has taught us. I think from a Catholic perspective, we need to also have a really serious think about what funerals are and how we offer them, because we usually would offer, or certainly in a lot of Catholic parishes, the Requiem Mass or the Mass as part of the funeral liturgy would become the kind of standard, although of course that's different practice in different places. I think we need to have a really serious think about how that service for the Queen spoke to the nation and how we might say, actually, the Queen had it with trumpeters and the rest of it, but you can have this. You can have Crimond, you can have the commendation and the committal and everything else. That is what the Church of England offers. And I think we need to get better at explaining that is not something special for the monarch. That is bread and butter for what you could have as a member of the public and a member of someone who lives in this country and speaks to their local parish.
I think you put your finger there on something that really has changed in the last 20 or 30 years in my experience, in that so many people now think of a funeral as primarily a celebration of a life that's ended, whereas I have always seen it as a commendation of a soul to God, and any celebration is peripheral.
And the Queen's funeral was ultimately a sad event. It wasn't, her virtues were described, but it was ultimately a sad event. It wasn't a celebration of life, and it chimed with the public mood in a way which I think almost many people feel, oh, well, we ought not to be too sad because they're in a better place, which is often a kind of generic term for meaning nothing. But we must be better at this. We must be better at saying it's okay, in fact it's good to mourn. And unless we can give people permission to mourn, then they're going to continue not to pop people into the crematorium without any service and hope that you don't have to deal with the sadness, and then have a big party down the pub and store up, wearing my psychiatrist's hat, store up all kinds of trouble for years to come.
Thank you for a remarkable lecture. My question's about stream services. Now, during the lockdowns, my family relied on streamed Eucharists. You know, we drew up our chairs on Sunday mornings, and our rector actually sent us consecrated hosts through the post. I'm not sure about the theology of that. But when we did return to church in person, to use that new expression, I actually realised what a sort of sham the streamed service had been, and that we were back with the real thing, as it were. Do you think that would be a common feeling amongst the committed churchgoers who have come back?
It's interesting because I think streaming services, there cannot be a single Eucharistic theology of streaming services in the same way that there is not a single Eucharistic theology in the Church of England about in-person, for want of a better phrase, Eucharistic services. So I think for different people it will have felt very different. But I agree with you in terms, from a sort of Catholic perspective, huge numbers of people were desperate to get back into the building, and that was not just because they wanted to hear the music live or they wanted to, you know, even receive communion necessarily. It was to be in communion with others, to be in fellowship, in communion with others in the building. And for many people that, and certainly people I've spoken to in the congregation I'm serving, for many people that was the key thing that had been missing, and the live streaming had got them through for a bit, but it had been a kind of hook to get them through. But the minute that they are back in the building, that things changed again. Now, of course, there's challenges there because some people can't get into church. And there are questions there about not wanting to call something second best when it's all that certain individuals can get. And so we have to be careful with our language. But I think there is something in its essence and in its experience which demarks those two forms of Eucharistic worship, or two ways of experiencing the Eucharist. And I think we kind of have to be a bit more honest about that, rather than saying everything's the same. There's this sort of desperation to say, welcome to everyone joining us online and in person, which is fine. But we have to also be honest that they're not the same. And that for people to say that they're not the same is okay, because they're not, and people experience them in different ways.
It seems one of the lessons that we should have learned from the pandemic. Thank you.
I've got a brief observation and a question. One of my bête noirs is the phrase past, because you will notice that those of little or no religion use the word past. And my question is always, and where have they gone? Whereas for we Christians, we will pass on, as Her Majesty did, to something else. But a good member of our congregation recently died of cancer, and she was absolutely adamant. She was dying, she would die, she would be dead. The P word was banned. My question, though, is you've talked about lessons to be learned and so on. We have no idea what this winter will bring. We have no idea what the next global pandemic will be. What do you think might be the most important thing for the parish church to prepare for? So at least this time round, we've got a plan for something, and we can just ignore what the bishops are saying. I never say. I'm a layman.
Good Catholic ecclesiology there. So I think the reality is that we just don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what this winter's going to look like. I think there's a potential for it to be catastrophic. The hospitals are a nightmare. I mean, my job is mostly a nightmare, but the hospitals are genuinely a nightmare in terms of numbers in certain places, although in other places they're less busy. So I think we're going to have a very, very challenging winter. Add to that, you know, the fuel crisis and everything else. So I think we're in for a really rocky ride this winter. And so I think one of the things that we're going to need to do on a parish level is to provide basic sustenance to people. there will be some parishes where that will be important, some parishes where it will be less important. But actually being there possibly to accompany people to the hospital, or to sit with the fearful, or to provide food for people who need it, and the rest of it. I think that's the kind of bread and butter of kind of Catholic mission. I think is going to be necessary this winter. I think in terms of preparing for the next, or preparing for another big impact, I think on a parish level too, we need to review how we did, and look at those, and in an open way. So I think we're really good, and I'm only relatively recent clergy, but I'm really good at this already, in just thinking that the clergy kind of have their finger on the pulse and know what's happening, and actually the reality, of course, is that's infrequently the case. Actually, and so I think we need to have much more open conversations with parishes, with PCCs, with congregations, about how they felt we did and what they think we could do differently. Doesn't mean we have to do it all. I know there's definitely someone in the congregation I'm in that would prefer that we didn't have, that the Eucharist was sent out exactly like your rector did. That ain't going to be happening. But I wonder but we haven't done that, like, sort of listening process to people. In a way, there's enough listening process in the church. We've not done it about the thing which has impacted everybody in a particular way. I thought you were going to ask about what could, given that there's probably more trouble coming, should the church really be spending time on reflecting? But I was going to say yes, they should. And actually, I think we firefight so much in the Church of England, and we're so reactive. And it would be so good if we had some proactive theological work being done on this, which perhaps respected the different theological positions and said, for some people, this Eucharist means this kind of thing, and this means, But I think we should be doing that, and I think the church should be commissioning that kind of work to be being done by serious scholars. But I've got no evidence that it has been.
Could I raise a couple of issues about governance, please? When you, towards the beginning of your lecture, you talked about the Archbishop. I'm a northerner. There were and are two archbishops in the Church of England. Did you mean to say what you said? And if so, why? And the other point is about, there is a now retired diocesan bishop who threatened his clergy with the clergy discipline measure if they did not comply with the Archbishop of Canterbury's instructions about closing churches and so on. Of course, if I were a church warden in the Diocese of X, my complaint against that diocesan bishop would lie to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who has a conflict of interest. Are our structures any good for dealing with this kind of thing in any kind of quick and effective and just way?
No. Next question. No, yes, I agree with you. I said the Archbishop because I suppose what I meant was my Archbishop, or the Archbishop of the province in which I sit, although I don't have a personal Archbishop, but I also don't have an Archbishop in the sense that's also actually faulty ecclesiology, where, I have a bishop and there is a provincial Archbishop. But you're right, but that comes into your second question, which is that what we haven't been acting like that. We have the Church of England, and I mentioned at the beginning of the Church of England, whatever that is. The Church of England has frequently essentially been the Archbishop's Council, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the Archbishops working together, or whatever it is, or the Dioceses working together, the House of Bishops, the College of Bishops, you name it. Very infrequently General Synod. And we haven't got any clarity over that. We've got no real clarity over where authority lies. So the comment that was made by the Archbishop of Canterbury saying that this wasn't a requirement, or this wasn't a rule. This was a recommendation. That was yes, exactly. Really, I mean, nobody really believed that, and that's not really acceptable. To be honest, and we talk a lot about authority and leadership in the church, but the one place where there's a real problem with authority and leadership seems to be in the church, and I worry that and back to my point about how do we collegially complain or collegially criticise, which I think is actually really important. We can't. So you could, during COVID pandemic, you could write to your diocesan, you could provide medical advice to your diocesan bishop, But your diocesan bishop would be held by some kind of gentleman's agreement, essentially, with all the other bishops in order to do what all the bishops agreed, even though many of them said that they didn't agree. So it was completely lacking in transparency. And I think transparency in governance is one of the things which COVID has laid bare, that we have big problems in terms of how our structures work. We have big problems in terms of how we hold people to account and who is even being held to account or who is even saying particular things. And I think it will be interesting to see in the new synod whether the new prolocutors of the houses see their role as being, from the clergy to the archbishops or from the archbishops to the clergy, for example, which I think was very grey during the pandemic, which I think was a great shame.
I can't imagine Hensley Henson being silent, or your namesake.
Oh, one more question.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. This may be an unfair question, as your talk is about the Church of England, but is there any evidence you're aware of other churches thinking more deeply or more widely and more seriously about, or more strategically about these issues, whether that's Roman Catholic or Orthodox or nonconformist?
Yeah. So I think from the Roman Catholic perspective, it's quite interesting because it was quite different in different nations in terms of the response. And there was quite a lot of criticism in various different countries about the Roman Catholic response, which of course was just the Roman Catholic response in X country. And that often related to government behaviour and kind of culture and the rest of it. I do think that Cardinal Nichols in this country gave a significant show of leadership during COVID. I think it was helpful. I think it was more measured, and I think there was also, particularly when churches were closed for, I can't remember if it was the second or the third time, but when churches were sort of unreasonably, in terms of all the evidence, closed, or rather just with no evidence were closed, that Cardinal Nichols actually stood up and said, come on, and actually Archbishop John and many other prelates said, this is nonsense. This must be the last time. This can't happen again. I think that was actually quite prophetic. I know I've sort of said that the Church of England's response wasn't brilliant, and I don't think it was. I think the reason that I'm particularly exercised by the Church of England's response is because it also holds the role of being the established church. And I think it's tricky to think of examples of other established churches in any similar sense that, and in terms of their COVID response. So I think there were other churches which have done some of the more practical stuff better. I'm not convinced there's been a deep level of thinking about live streaming and so on in other churches either. I think that's a problem. Although other churches have, for example, not kept their live streaming. So I know a number of churches in the Archdiocese of Southwark didn't keep their churches live streaming online. So you could watch it live, but that was it. So you either joined in live or you didn't go to Mass, which is a fundamentally different way of thinking things through. So there is much to learn from other traditions, and I think this is something probably that the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church could probably work pretty closely together on, because there's an awful lot of similarity in terms of the kind of practicality of what happened during COVID and what we can learn from it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bell. That was illuminating, interesting, thought-provoking, and I, for one, will be going back to my own parish and saying, what are we going to do next time, and can we plan it in advance? And when, or if, the Church of England gets round to having its COVID theology group, I think we can all suggest one person who should be a member, despite your comments about the current Archbishop of Canterbury, however, which most of us may agree with. Thank you so much indeed. That was very illuminating, and I think we've all enjoyed it. Thank you.